In the great year of 2020, I set a goal to play every main series Final Fantasy game. At the time, I'd only played FF12, which I know is a weird place to start, but I picked it up randomly way back in 2010, and as it turned out, I adored that game. But I was aware it broke from many series traditions, and I'd always wanted to try the older entries to see what a proper Final Fantasy experience was like. Well, in 2020 it was finally time. Since it was too late to start from the beginning anyway, and with 9 being one of the more beloved entries these days, I figured it was as good a place to start as any. Besides, I thoroughly enjoyed Octopath Traveler a few years back, and was told FF9 had a similar combat system, which isn't really true, but that's what I thought at the time, and it's one of the reasons I chose to start with 9. Anyway, here's the full list of everything I could tell you about Final Fantasy before playing the 9th installment. I knew Chocobos and Moogles are a staple of the series, and I recognized the classic Black Mage character design from artwork I'd seen over the years. I knew there was always a character named Cid, and that Cloud is a guy in Final Fantasy VII. Who is Cloud? I couldn't tell you, I just knew what he looked like. I knew there are crazy summons, which the Tales series apparently ripped off. That's what I heard anyway. And I knew advanced versions of spells have weird names like Fira and Firaga. And that's about it. I had no idea what to expect when starting up Final Fantasy IX. While I have played many FF games since then, for the rest of this video I'm going to share my thoughts as I wrote them way back in 2020. So this isn't a review of Final Fantasy IX, it's more of a newcomer's perspective, the thoughts of someone who's playing classics like this for the first time. What I got with Final Fantasy IX was a traditional JRPG, very similar to some of the Tales games I'd played, aside from the combat of course. This was a surprise, but not a complaint. As I understood from my research, FF9 was intended as a back-to-basics send-off for the series as its last entry on the original PlayStation. In hindsight, I'm glad I chose 9 for that reason. While I didn't catch most of the references to past games, I was able to appreciate all the tropes of Final Fantasy in a style of RPG I was familiar with. Let's start with the combat system since that's where most of the gameplay lies. First of all, the active time battle system doesn't add much to the experience. I was essentially still playing a turn-based game, except I had to rush for no reason. I hadn't felt this way playing Octopath or other similar games, so I gotta chalk this up to the outdated and sluggish presentation. The depth of the combat, on the other hand, was addictive. I now understand why the series gets so much praise for this. Learning how to take advantage of enemy weaknesses or using odd strategies like reflecting spells off your party members is a ton of fun, and the fact that these strategies are almost always effective is what seems to set this series apart from others. Frequently, when I play JRPGs and RPGs in general, weaknesses and resistances don't seem to matter much overall, and I find myself ignoring them. That's not the case here. Though I used Zidane's physical attacks and Vivi's Reflect for most of the game, being able to experiment on occasion and having it actually work was thrilling. I'm also a fan of how the stats and ability leveling system ties into weapon usage. I remember FF12 having something similar but way more complicated, which was a bit of a turnoff, though it didn't stop me from loving that game. Optimizing builds and planning what abilities I want to use or master first is my favorite part of RPGs, and that'd be the main reason for me to replay FF9 in the future. I will note though that I can't imagine playing this on an actual PS1. The frame rate is choppy enough on Switch, and battles are so slow I found myself constantly using the fast forward button. That button, by the way, is a godsend. I never want to play an RPG from this era without it again. Now, if I were a kid and had all the time in the world, I wouldn't use it, but it's such a time saver and I've played so many JRPGs already that I don't feel like I'm missing much using it. Traveling on the world map especially is immeasurably more enjoyable when you can zip around and quickly see everything. Sure, when the next giant JRPG like Xenoblade 3 comes out, I'll be taking my time exploring each little nook, but for older games without much happening in the overworld, I'm holding that button and not looking back. I finished in around 23 hours while doing most of the side content I found along the way, which is much less than estimates I found online. Thanks, fast forward. I did, however, skip the entire Chocobo Dig quest, since I didn't have a need for better weapons at any point. Before I go further, it's time for a logo review. don't take this too seriously, y'all. A logo has nothing to do with a game's quality, but Final Fantasy logos stand out from other series and have become iconic, so let's see how 9 stacks up. And well, it's okay. I like how the crystal is front and center, showcasing one of the key plot points, and from what I've gathered, the early Final Fantasies focused on similar crystals, so it's a nice reference that ties into the game's theme of celebrating the series' roots. On the other hand, it's a little plain. I appreciate the simplicity, but it's hard to get excited about this one. Alright, back to the side quests. There aren't a lot of them, which kinda disappointed me. I don't mind a linear story, that describes most of the genre, but there aren't many interesting things to do in all the cool locations aside from grind or continue with the story. The setting overall is standard fantasy with a little tech thrown in, and that's neither a negative or a positive for me. I'm all about presentation, and aside from the slow combat menus, Final Fantasy IX succeeds in that respect. This is the first JRPG I played from the PS1 era when 3D models were still new, so I don't have much to compare it with, but the pre-rendered backdrops in towns and dungeons are stunning throughout and blend super well with the character models, even in the remaster. I was shocked again the first time I reached the Overworld Map. For some reason, I didn't think the PS1 was capable of environments that expansive, and it just barely is, but it works, and with impressive draw distance for the time. You can tell the developers were quite familiar with the PS1 hardware by 1998 or so. I've heard a lot of opinions about the music, both that it's one of the best FF soundtracks ever and that it's not so great at all. I'm somewhere in the middle though. Aside from the glorious battle theme, which I never got tired of and remains in my head to this day, I can't recall any of the specific tracks, but I remember enjoying most of what I heard while adventuring. So the music gets a thumbs up from me, but it doesn't stand out, which is pretty typical for JRPGs. Finally, I don't have much to say about the story or characters. This might be a common theme as I work through this series, because for one, I'm not much good at story critique, and also, JRPG stories tend to be so formulaic to where I don't have much to add to the conversation. When a story is standout or exceptional, I'll mention it, but Final Fantasy IX is as standard as it gets. Tell me if you've heard this one before. A ragtag, unlikely group of companions, one of whom is royalty, begrudgingly get together to solve a local problem that turns out to be part of a regional conflict, which in turn is part of a bigger conspiracy involving a second world tied to the first via magical link that's dying for some reason. Then you kill God. Do I need to say more? This describes lots of JRPGs. Now, I like most of the characters, especially Steiner by about the midway point, but others, like Freya and Amaranth, felt tacked on, only there to fill out the party. Vivi's the only one with an interesting and original backstory, but even that wasn't explored deeply enough to leave a lasting impression. Don't get me wrong, Cooker Cutter's story ain't a negative. It had me engaged while playing, which is all I expect from a JRPG, but it's not something I thought about much since. It's a plus if a game has a great story, but that's not why I play. This is a little sad though. I only feel this way because I'm used to JRPGs all being basically the same, but I haven't played many of the classics I've heard so much about over the years. That's why I'm doing this series. Well, what is it about older JRPGs, and especially Final Fantasy, that people love? I've missed out on a lot of them, and I want to have an expert perspective on the genre, so I've got plenty of work ahead of me. And with that, I finished my first new Final Fantasy game in 10 years. As I go through them, I'll rank each entry on a tier list, just for fun. So let's take a look. I touch on this a bit, but I absolutely love FF12. It's still one of my favorite JRPGs, so that one goes in the S tier, no question. Final Fantasy IX, on the other hand, doesn't make it that high for me. I liked it a lot, but I want to leave room for games I might enjoy even more, so for now, I'm putting it right in the middle. That might change as I play more of the series though, and I'll update it as I go. Next time, I'll be taking on the Big Daddy, Final Fantasy VII. Yep, there's no rhyme or reason to which order I'm playing the series. I'm just picking what game sounds fun at the time, and going with it. Thanks for watching. Leave a like for that algorithm, subscribe for more videos on Final Fantasy and other RPGs, and have a blessed day.